Good morning, Liberty. It is Wednesday morning, June 26, 2019. My name is Michael Boldin, broadcasting to you live from my home office and studio here in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today. We are broadcasting live through our channels over at YouTube, Facebook, Periscope, DLive, Twitch. We have our archives, podcast versions on iTunes and Spotify over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Good Morning Liberty. So today's episode, we're talking about strategy to defend the Constitution and advance liberty. This is actually part of what's become a four-part series that started last week, Friday for part one, and then on Monday with part two of our core principles that I think are really just kind of coming clear to me as well, as we just celebrated our 13-year anniversary yesterday. So this is really kind of fun for me to go through some of these important principles that drive our work. So first, we're going to talk about three things that people do when they're faced with actions of the federal government they don't like, whether they dislike the policy or whether they see them as unconstitutional or wrong, whatever they may be. The three things that most people do. I'm going to quickly go over those and then point out that none of them should actually be one of the first things that anybody does. It's bad strategy and actually goes against the advice of founders like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Then I want to talk a little bit, I'm just going to go in kind of an overview mode of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's advice on how to deal with federal overreach, but then also dig a little bit deeper and go further back to the Stamp Act time and then the years before the Revolution, and then through the ratification period for the Constitution. So we have this kind of holistic view of how the founders and old revolutionaries viewed strategy, how to deal with a government that doesn't follow its own limits, which I think is kind of redundant. But I do want to say hello to my friends out in the live chat. I'm very grateful for those of you spending some time with me. I think it's very awesome that you're willing to hear me blab day in and day out. Well, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Hi to Justin Bayola, Ward Lawrence, and Denver Libertarian. Tyler B., Rachel Kennerly, good to see you. Hopefully we can schedule that podcast interview soon. Idamon, good to see you as well, buddy. Over on YouTube, on Facebook, Dan Reed, Scott, Richard, another Richard, Roy, Kester, Justin, and a few others over on Facebook. I appreciate you guys spending time, and hi to Andrew Nappy, and thank you for the happy anniversary wishes. I really appreciate your support and friendship over the years, Andrew. And hi to Madinoff as well. So whether you're watching live or in the archive, thank you very much for spending some time with me today. I really, really appreciate it. Now, first, before getting into all the details, I want to share two previous episodes that people have, that I've done here, that I think people should actually check out as kind of a backgrounder. First of all, this episode from last November from James Madison, relying on elections is a bad strategy. And then also, oh, I didn't pull up the other one. There's another episode here, Thomas Jefferson's strategy for nullification. I will make sure both of those are in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Good Morning Liberty. So if you're checking it out, especially in the archives, you can find that. We generally publish the archive episode with all the links about 30 minutes to an hour after I'm done doing the live stream. So keep an eye out for that. So first of all, three things that people tend to do to deal with federal programs they don't like or federal programs they see as unconstitutional. Three things that almost everybody does. One, they say we should call Congress. Make a phone call, demand that your imperial representative or imperial senator, they should do something or stop doing something. Asking a federal politician to limit federal power. The second thing they do is they demand that we sue in federal court. In other words, go to a branch of the federal government in the hopes that the federal courts are going to limit federal power. And the third, probably the most popular one that I hear, is that we should vote the bums out. And that rests on the assumption that the new bums are going to come in and say, look at all this federal power that's sitting here on a platter for me. I'm just going to say no to it. I'm going to try to work every single day to turn over all that federal power that's existed over these decades. And all of these strategies that most people use, if they're actually trying to do something, all of these strategies are basically relying on the federal government to limit itself. And if we recognize the absurdity of that, going to an entity with the hopes that the entity that violates the rules is going to start self-policing and all of a sudden just voluntarily follow the rules is not just absurd, but it's incredibly dangerous. And both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison warned us about this for many, many years, most prominently in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of 1798 in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. They warned us that if you look to the federal government to limit its own power, to determine the extent of its own powers, you shouldn't be surprised if that power always grows and grows and grows and grows. And don't be surprised here, but both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were absolutely correct. History has proven them to be absolutely right. So let's take a look at what a different type of strategy we should have. And I covered this again in November. Relying on elections is a bad strategy. This was right around election time, talking about James Madison's 4 steps. I'm only going to cover it briefly here. And then I'm also going to get a little bit into Thomas Jefferson's advice as well. In Federalist number 46, James Madison gave us a 4-step approach on how to deal with federal programs that were either what he called unwarrantable, which meant unconstitutional. They weren't warranted by the power delegated in the Constitution, or warrantable but bad policy. So even if the federal government is authorized to do something, Madison didn't change the advice. Basically, the strategy remains the same. How do you deal with stuff that you want to stop that's coming out of Washington, D.C.? And those 4 things are right here in this article that I will have linked in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty, just in case you missed that the last few times I mentioned it. 1, a disquietude of the people. Basically, the people should be throwing a hissy fit every single time the federal government does something outside the scope of its delegated powers in the Constitution. 2, their repugnance, the repugnance of the people, and a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Now, repugnance, you, like I, might look at politicians and government actions to be repugnant to our ideals. You find it disgusting, gross, awful, horrible, evil, whatever it may be, all these synonyms to repugnant. But that's not how the word was used in the popular dictionaries at the time. The number 1 dictionary at the time, and I think this was Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, defined repugnance as, quote, disobedient, not obsequious. And if you look up obsequious in that same dictionary, it says not compliant. So the people, Madison said, their repugnance, perhaps refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. So Madison is specifically saying, refuse to cooperate. Not my words, James Madison, father of the Constitution's words. Disobey them. Don't follow their orders. Because as long as people continue to comply with government policies, there's no reason for government to overturn them. There's zero reason. You can complain all you want on social media. You can make all the phone calls to Washington, D.C., and for those of you who still do fax campaigns, all that stuff, it will never change as long as people continue to comply with them. James Madison knew this. We should know it as well. So disquietude, protest, complain, but then also actively disobey and refuse to cooperate with officers of the Union. 3, governors have to be talking about this as well. Now, the problem is there's a lot of bad governors, about 50 of them, 57 depending who's counting. There's bad governors in every single state. They may say something right about one policy or another, but in general, none of them are constitutionalists. They should be outspoken all the time. So when they're outspoken about one policy or another, that's federal overreach. That's positive. Of course, they need to be pushed in a better direction in the future. And then 4 is legislative devices, as Madison said, which would often be added on such occasions. Now, legislative devices from state and local legislatures, city councils, county commissions, etc. Madison didn't say specifically what to do, but basically he left this open-ended. We know through history a way of actually implementing this, because just years later, now Madison wrote this in 1788, I believe. Federalist 46 came out, maybe late 1787, somewhere around there. But just a little bit later, about a decade later, in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, we know they used legislative devices. They passed these resolutions in Kentucky and Virginia calling on the states to interpose in Virginia, that was in Madison's terms, or in Jefferson's terms, to nullify. A nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So that year, that's when the Adams administration, from this article, passed a wildly unconstitutional attack on the freedom of speech with the Alien and Sedition Acts. In response, while sitting as vice president, Jefferson secretly drafted the Kentucky resolutions, and here's a little of what he wrote. And I covered this again in the article in the episode Thomas Jefferson's Strategy for Nullification that was earlier this month in June of 2019. He says, every state has a natural right in cases not within the compact, not within the Constitution, when the federal government is doing things outside of the Constitution, to nullify of their own authority all assumptions of powers by others within their limits. Without this right, they would be under the dominion, absolute and unlimited, of whosoever might exercise this right of judgment for them. And he says, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Jefferson did not say, when they assume powers that were not delegated to them, go to the federal court. And if the federal court doesn't agree with you, and then you should vote the bums out. And then if the new people don't agree with you as well, then nullify. He doesn't say all of those precursors. He doesn't mention any of those free steps. He doesn't say roll up on Washington, D.C. and lead a protest on the mall. He doesn't say go sue them in federal court. He doesn't say vote the bums out. None of these things. All of these things are absent in Thomas Jefferson's advice. He says when they assume undelegated powers. Nullification is the rightful remedy, not voting the bums out. And in fact, Madison's four-step advice in Federalist 46 also does not mention suing in federal court. It does not mention voting the bums out. And it does not mention marches on D.C. I mean, maybe the disquietude of the people, the protests, that would actually qualify under Madison's advice. So in 1798, Madison also drafted the Virginia resolutions, and he says this: in case of a deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted by the said compact, again, the compact, which is the Constitution, the states who are parties thereto have the right and are in duty bound to interpose for arresting the progress of the evil and for maintaining within their respective limits the authorities, rights, and liberties appertaining to them. Duty bound. Not just a good idea, but absolutely their duty. But they weren't alone. Madison and Jefferson didn't come up with these ideas. They didn't make them up out of thin air. This wasn't brand new, and this was widely understood as a way forward. There was a lot of objection from Federalist-controlled politicians, people who were on the side of the Alien and Sedition Acts. They said, look, this is not the right approach to deal with Alien and Sedition Acts. Your approach is actually wrong. But the revolutionary spirit, the early American spirit, the views of the Constitution all supported this. And I want to go a little bit further back to the time of the Stamp Act. And here on December 20th, 1765, here's John Adams, who eventually signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which I think is ironic. But in his earlier days, I think a lot of stuff that Adams did was incredibly good. Check this out. Sounds very similar. The Stamp Act, I take it, is utterly void. The Stamp Act is utterly void and of no binding force upon us, for it is against our rights as men and our privileges as Englishmen. An act made in defiance of the first principles of justice, an act which rips up the foundation of the British Constitution, the unwritten one, they called it the ancient Constitution, and makes void maxims of 1800 years standing. Same principle. John Adams saw the Stamp Act as something that was not authorized, something that Parliament was not authorized to pass. They weren't delegated a power to do this, and so therefore it was considered void and of no binding force on the people. Same view that Thomas Jefferson had to say in 1798. Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, he said, their acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Same term, void. And again, Adams wasn't even alone. In response to the Stamp Act, Patrick Henry, he drafted a series of resolutions, the original Virginia Resolves. But in 1765, he called the Stamp Act illegal, unconstitutional, and unjust. This was actually before. Turns out it was in May of 1765 where the Virginia House of Burgesses passed the resolutions. And another resolution that he had introduced that he actually made a strategic move after a series of resolutions passed easily. He decided to leave to go home. I don't know if he had a long ride or something like this. And then there was some political maneuvering. And this resolution that I'm about to read to you actually didn't pass, but it ended up being printed in newspapers all throughout the colonies. And people actually responded to it as if it was. He says, "Resolve that His Majesty's liege people, the inhabitants of this colony, are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatsoever designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them other than the laws and ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid." So in other words, it's the same view that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had in 1798. This wasn't a new idea, that if a far-off government tried to enact something that was only reserved to the local government or the colonial government, then no one was bound to obey it. That was Patrick Henry's terms. Thomas Jefferson didn't make that up. James Madison didn't make that up. And in fact, I would say under what was known as the principle of subsidiarity, which I think we should dig into at some point in the future, Patrick Henry didn't make this up either. But he certainly popularized it by introducing this as a resolution in response to the Stamp Act. And even though this resolution, particular one, that you are not bound obedience to any undelegated power about taxation specifically, even though that didn't pass, this was very popularly read, widely read, and widely understood by people. And he wasn't alone, of course. We know how the Loyal Nine, this was the precursor to the Sons of Liberty that was headed up by Samuel Adams and others up in Boston, how they dealt with the Stamp Act. This was a little bit more aggressive, of course, than passing resolutions talking about refusing obedience. But John Hancock, he sent a letter to his agent in London, Jonathan Bernard, and he says this: "The people of this country will never suffer themselves to be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act." This was about the Stamp Act once again. Again, the view is very consistent. When they do stuff that they're not supposed to do, you are not bound to obey them. And it's not just Thomas Jefferson, it's not just James Madison, it's even John Adams, who Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were opposing in 1798. It's Patrick Henry, it's John Hancock, and many others. We also know that during the ratification debates in the several states, this type of view was brought up pretty regularly. For example, Archibald McLean, he was a well-known attorney and a head of the opposition to the Stamp Act in North Carolina. He was a Federalist. He supported ratification of the Constitution, but he even supported this same view as well, that if they do stuff they're not supposed to do, you are not bound to obey them. He says this, quote, "If Congress should make a law beyond its powers and the spirit of the Constitution, should we not say to Congress, you have no authority to make this law. There are limits beyond which you cannot go. You cannot exceed the power prescribed by the Constitution. You are amenable to us for your conduct. That act is unconstitutional. We will disregard it and punish you for the attempt." Now, that extra one on the end, we don't hear too often from many others. But disregard it. They all say you are not bound to obey it. All acts outside of the Constitution are immediately considered void. It's just a matter of us doing something to treat it that way as well. Theophilus Parsons, another attorney, a leading advocate, a Federalist in support of the Constitution, made the same case. He says this. This was in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. I believe that was in June of that year. An act of usurpation. Now, usurpation is what many of the founders talked about when government takes powers or exercise powers that it's not allowed to do. A usurpation is a theft. It's a stealing of power. So anytime they do something under the Commerce Clause, general welfare, whatever, anytime they do anything that the Constitution has not delegated to Washington, D.C., this is stealing power that doesn't belong to them. They called it arbitrary power, but usurpation was probably more popular. An act of usurpation is not obligatory, says Parsons. It is not law, and any man may be justified in his resistance. Not complaining about it, again, not voting the bums out, but soon as they do something, any act outside the Constitution should not be seen as law, and it needs to be, you're justified in resisting it. Now, he didn't say in every situation you're going to have to go out in the streets and go absolutely ape and resist everything. We obviously have to understand Thomas Jefferson's strategy, which I talked about in that episode earlier this month, where he also said we should push as far as events will render prudent. We also have to understand that there are facts on the ground that makes resistance a strategic approach. And even Alexander Hamilton, the big government guy of the day, the worst of the worst, the flip-flopper, the guy who would scam people into thinking that the Constitution, or say he would side with opponents saying, oh, no, don't worry about this, knowing full well that months or years later he was going to advocate more centralized power anyways. But here in Federalist 33, he sure got it right. He was talking about federal acts outside of the Constitution, and he said they would not be supreme. This is how Hamilton put it. These will be merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such. Not only should we view them as a theft of power, as a ripoff, as an evil act of government, unconstitutional, illegal, immoral, unjust, whatever you want to call it, but they all deserve to be treated that way too. So this is the consistent view from the founding generation, from the old revolutionaries. It comes from the days it really picked up steam in response to the Stamp Act, in response to the Townshend Acts, the Quartering Act. The New York Assembly did not want to fund the quartering of British soldiers. This is an unfunded mandate of 1765. It was passed shortly after the Stamp Act, was given royal assent that same year. And so the Quartering Act wanted to pay for troops. New York said, no way, we don't want to do that. And they resisted. In fact, most of the colonies did. I think Pennsylvania is one of the only ones that, at least for a period of 2 years, most of the colonies actually refused to participate. They just said, we're not going to do this. So here's the bottom line. You're not supposed to wait 2 or 4 years for some new politician to get into office and say to you, look, we're really sorry about all these ways we've been violating your rights. I'm going to work to overturn those. And you just sit on the sideline while I spend the next few years trying to get all that stuff repealed. You're not supposed to sit on the sidelines and wait. You're not supposed to wait for permission from federal politicians to say, okay, you can be free. You're not supposed to wait a year or 2 years or 4 years or 6 years or however long it's supposed to take for the Supreme Court to take up a case about something that violates your rights and then give you permission to be free. You're not supposed to wait. You're not supposed to sit on the sidelines in the hopes that the federal government is going to limit itself. You're supposed to stand up, refuse, resist, and nullify federal acts outside of the Constitution as soon as they happen. Now, that doesn't mean that the response to every single one is going to be exactly the same. But if you have this mentality that voting the bums out only gives you new bums, going to the federal courts only relies on federal employees, federal judges to limit federal power and voting the bums out. Wow, I got to keep saying it. It just keeps giving you more bums. All the money, time, and energy that people throw at doing these things, winning in federal court or taking over Congress, will never work unless, of course, this is a supplementary act coupled with resisting on state, local, and individual level right now. And all that resistance really needs to be your first response to federal overreach, not your last. So looking over at the live chat, Theodore Underhill, great quote from Patrick Henry. Is peace so sweet or life so dear to be purchased at the price of chains or slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. Jane Stetz Peterson says, this is a question that I'm asked a lot. What can be done about it? I tell them to call, email, and go see the politician in their own area. Yes, not in Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. does not limit itself. Absolutely correct. Second Amendment for Canada. I love inalienable natural freedoms, liberties, and rights. Shane Lackey, thumbs up over to Theodore as well on that Patrick Henry quote. Take back the power, says Bill Moody. Yes, and that comes right from Thomas Jefferson as well. The way Jefferson described a free people, he said, and we post this as a meme on our social channels all the time, and we can't say it enough. A free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. If you're free, you exercise your rights, whether government wants you to or not. Frank I, it's all a big club and we ain't in it. George Carlin, we miss that guy. That was incredible. But thankful for YouTube and other places which may not be friendly to us, but we can still see this stuff all over the place. Carlo, you're absolutely right over on Facebook. Any law written against the Constitution is null and void. Yes, in law, in principle, they are null and void. But as long as the people continue to comply with them, they are in effect in practice. So when Trump says, turn in your bump stocks, or maybe he'll say, turn in your firearm suppressors, there is more gun control now than there was under Obama if people comply with it. Theodore as well, we have to evoke these natural rights. Russell Straw says, hey, love the show. I can't believe I didn't realize there was a podcast. Been listening every day since. That is awesome. Yeah, you know, we haven't really pushed this. And I did a podcast for the 10th Amendment Center a number of years ago. Maybe, I'm thinking like in 2010, 2011. I was interviewing people like Kevin Gutzman. I think Brian McClanahan may have been on at some point. Rob Nadelson. A number of people about constitutional clauses and issues. And then I just didn't stick with it for some reason. I think this was kind of a little early on before the podcast thing really caught on. And I left it. I was dumb and I just let it go. And then as I see everybody following podcasts today, I just thought to myself last summer, you know, I've got this home-built studio that I put together. It seems to work pretty well. I've got really good internet. Why not just start doing it and see if people are interested? And we've really, really grown. We're not getting huge reach yet, but I'm very grateful to everyone who likes, subscribes, hits the bell button for notifications, leaves comments, reviews, all that stuff. I'm so grateful for that because we've gone from about 150 listens or views per episode to somewhere about 800 to 1,000, which is small. I would like to see us get 20,000 or more in the next year or two and continue growing from there. But we've basically gone up about 5 times in 1 year. And I think that's incredible growth. I would love to have more. And the way that we get more is people taking those free actions on whatever platform you're watching or listening on, because they're all easily triggered. So when you actually hit that like button or you share a link or you leave a comment or you leave a review, it tells the platform, I've got to show this to more and more people. So please continue to do that. I'm very grateful. And thank you for mentioning it. Thank you for joining us, Russell. Thank you so much. So let me just look through a little bit more in the live chat. Yeah, a lot of good stuff here. I don't think I can I'm going backwards. I don't know if I'm going to keep up with it, but I appreciate all the comments. I will take a look at them after I'm done with the broadcast, maybe a little bit later today. I'm going to go meet a friend for lunch. But I hope you guys found this interesting, educational. I'm going to have another follow-up show in this series on our core principles, talking about Concordia res parve crescunt. For those of you who have 10th Amendment Center membership cards, or if you scroll to the bottom of most of the pages on our website, you'll see that Latin phrase. It means small things grow great by concord. Step by step, we can move forward for liberty. So I'm going to cover that in our Fast Friday edition of the show on Friday morning, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Till then, I hope you have an awesome day. I'm very grateful for you spending time with me. I'm very grateful for all the happy anniversary wishes we received over on social, all the different channels, and by email. Thank you so very much for being with us, and thank you so much for your support. Of course, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members if you want to join us for as little as $2 a month. Thanks again. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.